men, surrounded on 3 sides, ammunition nearly gone. Radio dying, storm overhead so thick that no aircraft could punch through. They were 12 hours from being erased from the map of the living, and the most powerful military machine in human history. 500,000 soldiers, 10,000 helicopters, enough bombs to crack the earth open, could do absolutely nothing to save them. Nothing. Except one unit. 5 men who moved through the jungle like the jungle itself had given them permission to exist. Who communicated without speaking, who passed within arm's reach of enemy soldiers and left no trace, who had been trained not just to survive in the darkness, but to own it. Tonight, we are opening the file that was never supposed to be opened. The operation they called impossible. The crossing that nearly killed them all. The duel fought in pitch black between 2 men who were both the best at the same thing, and the 12 seconds of violence that shattered the enemy's spine and bought just enough time for salvation to arrive. This is not a story about luck. This is a story about what a human being becomes when every last option has been stripped away, and 5 men decide that failure is simply not something they are willing to accept. Stay until the end, because the final moments of this operation were witnessed by men who said afterward that they had seen something that night that they could not explain, something that did not belong in the same category as ordinary war. They called it the Operation of Ghosts, and they were right. Phuoc Tuy Province, Vietnam, 12 hours before midnight. Staff Sergeant James Miller had been in bad situations before. Every man in the 101st Airborne had. You did not survive this war without accumulating a catalog of moments that you spent the rest of your life trying not to think about too clearly. But this was different. The mission had started simply enough. 6 men, a narrow ridge overlooking a bamboo-choked valley. Reconnaissance only. Confirm reports of a new supply route. Record coordinates. Get out without being seen. Standard procedure. The jungle had its own plans. The first warning came not with sound, but with the absence of it. The birds stopped calling. The cicadas cut off mid-rhythm. Even the wind seemed to pause. The forest holding its breath, the way a crowd goes silent before a car crash. Miller raised his fist, and the column froze. His eyes swept the tree line, searching for the glint of a barrel, the shadow that was the wrong shape. Then the smell hit him. Not smoke, not rot, fish sauce, sharp and recent, enemy, close and fresh. He crouched over a set of boot prints in the mud. The edges were still clean, the walls of each impression barely beginning to soften. Minutes old, maybe less. He counted the prints. A dozen, possibly more. He signaled east, higher ground. They would arc around whatever patrol had passed through and continue the mission. For 2 hours, the forest stayed quiet. It was a lie, a beautiful, surgical, patient lie. Because what Miller had spotted was not a patrol. It was the leading edge of something much larger. A supply column, 15 porters hauling ammunition crates and rice bags, stretching back into the jungle farther than anyone could see. And by the time the point man raised his fist and pointed down into the ravine, it was already too late to simply back away. Because the soldier at the rear of the column had stepped off the trail to relieve himself, had glanced up at exactly the wrong moment, had seen something, a shadow, a boot heel, a movement in the periphery that was not quite right. His mouth opened. The suppressed shot that dropped him was silent, but silence was no longer the team's ally. Voices erupted. Commands crackled through the trees. Dozens of heads turned, and then the jungle detonated. Automatic fire ripped through the undergrowth, shredding bark and sending dirt fountaining in every direction. The team scattered behind roots and stumps, returning controlled bursts to slow the first wave. But they were not fighting a patrol anymore. They had kicked open a hornet's nest. Within minutes, enemy troops were flanking both sides, funneling the Americans into a pocket of dense undergrowth barely the size of a basketball court. The radio operator took shrapnel through the shoulder. A private took a round that punched through his pack and left a crease across his ribs. The radio itself was drowning in monsoon static, every transmission dissolving before it reached anyone. By late afternoon, the noose had been drawn tight. 30 men, 40, more arriving in organized waves, positioning themselves for the final push at dawn. Miller pressed the transmit button one more time. His jaw locked so hard his teeth ached, his voice barely above a whisper into the dark. He told the static that they were surrounded, that they were almost out of ammunition, that movement was impossible, that he needed anything, anyone, whatever could be spared. For a long moment, only rain answered, and then a voice came back through the hiss, calm, unhurried, an accent that did not belong to any American unit on any map that Miller had ever seen. Call sign Dingo 5, Australian. The voice told him to hold position. It told him not to move. It told him that help was coming. Miller looked at the faces of his men, caked in mud, running on fumes of adrenaline and dread, and did not know whether to feel hope or terror. He decided on hope because he had no other choice. Less than 2 kilometers away, 5 men were already moving. They did not know Miller by name. They did not know the faces pressed into the mud waiting for them. What they had was a set of coordinates, a set of radio fragments, and a complete and total understanding of what those coordinates meant. They moved through the darkness like the darkness itself had given them passage. Corporal Ryan Stone took point, lean, weathered, rifle tucked tight against his body with the barrel never rising above his sightline, a habit so deeply ingrained it had become reflex. Behind him, Sergeant Thomas Blake read the ground with the focused intensity of a doctor reading an X-ray, parsing every displaced leaf and compressed patch of mud as language. Behind Blake came Roland with the radio pack, Quinn with his weapon angled diagonally across his thigh, and at the rear, Lawson, the medic, big as a rugby prop, moving with a silence that made no sense for a man his size. 5 shadows, tied by instinct. Blake raised a fist and the patrol stopped. Not slowed, not crouched, stopped, as completely and absolutely as if someone had cut the power. The doctrine they called the freeze. You did not shift your weight to relieve a cramping leg. You did not wipe the sweat from your eyes. You did not swallow unless you had no choice. If a mosquito found your neck, you let it feed, because movement is what the human eye detects first. Remove the movement, and you remove yourself from the equation entirely. Stone lowered himself and brought his fingers to the ground. The mud was still warm. He brought 2 fingers to his nose. Fish sauce, tobacco, unwashed fabric. A large enemy force had passed through here less than 10 minutes ago. Blake tapped his shoulder once. They kept moving. The second technique was what they called the fade. Not a retreat and not an advance. Something in between. A controlled drift through the jungle that was less like walking and more like dissolving. Movement slowed until their silhouettes merged with the shadows around them. Boots found only the softest earth. Bodies turned sideways to slip between hanging vines rather than push them, because a swaying vine is a signal to any watching eye. For 20 minutes, they advanced without a word spoken. Then Blake froze them again. Ahead, through a lattice of wet vegetation, 3 enemy soldiers stood near a fallen log. One lit a cigarette, the brief orange flare illuminating his face at 20 yards. 20 yards. The distance you could throw a stone across. The 3 men talked in low voices, scanned the trees, then turned and moved down the slope, directly toward the Americans. Blake's jaw tightened. He made a rapid signal. Advance with maximum fade, and the team resumed moving, this time even slower, curving north to circle around the projected enemy path. 10 minutes later, Roland's radio crackled with a faint pulse. He crouched and whispered that he had a signal. The Americans were close. They were also out of time. The basin was dark and dense, canopies so thick that even the rain barely penetrated, falling instead as a fine mist that coated everything in a thin skin of moisture. Stone stopped. He parted a fern with one gloved fingertip. A face stared back at him through the leaves, young, maybe 20, eyes wide enough to swallow the dark, an American helmet with a playing card tucked into the band. The private's chest expanded, his lips separated. Stone moved like a striking snake, closing the final distance in a blur, one hand clamping over the boy's mouth and pinning his head gently but absolutely to the earth. His other hand gripped the soldier's shoulder, firm, steady, unmistakably human. He put his mouth to the American's ear and whispered 2 words, barely air, friendly, SAS. The private's thrashing stopped. Terror slowly converted to confusion, then to something approaching disbelief. Stone eased his grip and guided the young soldier back into deeper cover. The rest of the reconnaissance team materialized from the shadows. Miller and his men, faces sunken from fear and sleeplessness, eyes that had been looking at their own deaths for 12 hours. They stared at the 5 Australians the way shipwrecked men stare at a light on the horizon. Miller started to speak. Blake's hand shot up. Freeze! Heavy footsteps in the undergrowth. Multiple sets. Close. Blake dropped flat. The Australians melted into the earth with a speed and completeness that made the Americans stare. One moment, there were men. The next, nothing. Just jungle. Just mud and vines and shadows. Miller pressed himself flat and pulled his men down. An enemy patrol entered the basin. 8 soldiers, moving slowly. Rifles swinging in arcs. Boots sucking at the mud. One stopped 3 meters from where Miller lay, tilted his head, and listened to the forest with the focused patience of a man who knew what silence sounded like when it was natural and when it was hiding something. The Americans stopped breathing. One of the younger soldiers began to tremble. Fine, uncontrollable vibrations running through his whole body, from cold and terror and the accumulated weight of 12 hours of certainty that he was going to die. Lawson, the medic, without a sound, slid his massive body over the boy like a blanket and absorbed the tremors with his own mass, a human shield against the invisible. The enemy soldier wiped rain from his face, muttered something, moved on. The patrol drifted east and disappeared. Miller exhaled through his nose, slow and silent. Blake leaned close and whispered the only words he would speak for the next 2 hours. Move now, no talking. 11 men in the darkness, 5 of them ghosts, 6 of them learning. They moved for 50 meters before Blake halted them again. The jungle had changed. The vibrations through the ground were not random, they were coordinated. The NVA wasn't searching, they were sweeping. A systematic spiral tightening around the last known American position. Dozens of men, maybe more. Blake signaled freeze. Everyone dropped. The enemy came from all directions simultaneously. Boots. Dozens of them, flashlight beams cutting through the undergrowth in short, precise sweeps. Voices giving orders, receiving confirmations, adjusting the net. One beam swung toward their position and held 4 seconds. 5, not directly on them, but close enough that every man lying in that mud could feel it, the way you feel heat from a fire before you see the flame. The youngest private began to gag silently. Rainwater had pooled near his mouth, and the convulsive need to cough was climbing his throat like a fist. Blake saw it happening. Without a sound, he scooped a handful of wet mud and pressed it against the soldier's lips. The corporal tasted grit. He swallowed it. His throat locked down. His eyes went wide with shock, but his silence held. An enemy soldier knelt 2 meters away and pushed aside a clump of grass with his rifle barrel. His partner jabbed at the undergrowth just to the left of Quinn's shoulder. 12 men lay in the mud and did not exist. The soldiers conferred in whispers, moved on. 30 seconds of silence. Then Blake's 2-finger signal, the fade. They slipped through a seam in the enemy net, a narrow gap between 2 fallen ironwood trees created by a lightning strike decades ago, a space barely wide enough for one man to pass through at a time. Blake went first. Miller followed. Then the Australians guided each American through with hands on shoulders and silent corrections. Tapped the magazine to tighten it, pushed the antenna down, placed the foot flatter. The 6 Americans were not ghosts, but they were becoming the best students in the world's most unforgiving classroom. On the map from 24 hours prior, it had been marked as a creek, ankle deep, easily crossed. The monsoon had rewritten the map. What blocked their path now was a roaring, churning wall of mud-brown water 50 feet wide, fed by 3 days of relentless rain and carrying uprooted trees in its current like toys. The sound was enormous, a continuous thunder that swallowed voices and could mask their noise, but could also act as a beacon, drawing every enemy patrol within a kilometer. There was no way around it. Blake formulated the plan in seconds. A rope across the gap, one at a time. Pray that the submerged boulders held their footing. Stone entered the water first, moving with the steady, controlled grace that defined everything he did. His body angled against the current, boots finding purchase on the slick rock beneath. He reached the far bank and secured the rope to an ironwood tree with a knot so practiced it took 4 seconds. The crossing began. It was agonizing. Exhausted men in frigid, chest-deep water, clinging to a rope while the current tore at their legs and the darkness made every step a blind commitment. The wounded moved slowest, teeth clenched against the cold and the pain, guided by hands they could not see. Then, disaster. One of the Americans, his injured leg giving way on a submerged boulder, lost the rope. The river took him instantly. No scream, just the brief, muffled sound of a body surrendering to water, and then he was gone downstream, tumbling through the churning dark. Panic ignited in the eyes of the remaining men on both banks, a spark that, if it caught, would consume everything they had survived. Lawson was already gone. Without a sound, without hesitation, the giant medic plunged into the torrent after the drowning American. Not a splash of heroics, a controlled, purposeful entry. He found the soldier underwater, wrapped an arm around his chest in a grip that allowed no argument, and held him down, because the man's instinct was to surface and a gasp would have killed them all. Lawson held him under and pulled him toward the far bank, a brutal act of care. A man nearly drowned to save his life. They surfaced together in the shallows, and Lawson clamped a hand over his mouth before the first sound could escape. He gave him one long look in the darkness. The American understood. He nodded. They crossed in silence.
Blake knew something was wrong before anyone else registered it. It was not a sound, not a movement. It was the quality of the silence behind them, too deliberate, too patient, too intelligent. A silence that was not empty, a silence that was listening. He read the signs as they moved, a bent blade of grass that should have recovered, a pebble displaced from moss without any scuff mark, a single strand of a spider's web broken at chest height across the trail they had just traveled. Not a platoon, not a squad, one man, a tracker, and not an ordinary one. Blake knew the Doc Cong, the Viet Cong's elite special operations force. He had encountered their work before, patient, expert, capable of following a trail that most men could not even see. And right now, one of them was threading through the darkness behind them, reading their passage like a book, herding them toward a killing ground where a reception was already being prepared. Blake made the decision that went against everything the role of a patrol sergeant demands. He had to leave the group. He signaled Stone, "Continue to the extraction point. 20 minutes. Do not wait." The Americans looked at him in confusion. Stone gave him a single sharp nod that contained no questions. Blake stripped off his pack, kept only his knife, his sidearm, and a length of garrote wire. He turned back into the darkness. What followed was a duel that had no audience and left no record in any official document. Blake did not hunt the man. He hunted the man's signs. A spot where the tracker had paused, identified by two small indentations where he had rested on his knuckles while reading the ground ahead. The tracker was good enough to know by now that his quarry had noticed the pursuit. The game had changed for both of them. For 60 minutes, two specialists circled each other inside 100 square meters of impenetrable jungle. A contest reduced to pure sensation. Every snapped twig was a feint. Every rustle of leaves was a misdirection. The call of a nightbird from a direction that did not feel right. Blake used the oldest technique in the playbook. He created a small sound, a whisper of disturbed leaves, 12 meters to his left. Then he froze. The tracker was too skilled to be fully deceived, but he was human. His attention shifted fractionally to the left for less than a second. Blake came from the right. 2 steps. Explosive, silent, total. The struggle lasted less than 5 seconds. When it was over, Blake stood in the darkness over the fallen man and felt nothing that war manuals have words for. Not triumph, not relief, just the cold and necessary weight of having done what survival required. He found the trail the others had taken and ran. The tracker's silence would not go unnoticed for long. When the Doc Cong commander realized his specialist had stopped reporting, he would not pause to consider options. He would swarm. Blake rejoined the column without speaking. The blood on his uniform said everything. The jungle behind them erupted 8 minutes later. A whistle, sharp and piercing, cutting through the thunder, then another, then a third coming from a different direction. The enemy was not searching anymore. They were closing, angry, organized, and done with patience. Blake made one signal. He pointed to a narrow funnel of terrain formed by 2 massive rock outcroppings 40 meters ahead. Not a place to hide, a place to kill. The Australians and Americans spread along the rocks and wet logs flanking the trail, weapons trained back on the dark throat they had just walked through. Everyone pressed flat. Everyone pointed forward. Blake held up one finger. They waited. The enemy vanguard came fast, careless in their rage, crashing through undergrowth with the noise of men who believed they had their prey cornered and simply needed to arrive. The first silhouette appeared in a flash of lightning. 3 more behind it. Blake dropped his finger. For 12 seconds, the jungle became a contained apocalypse. 12 automatic rifles firing simultaneously in a coordinated wall of lead. Tracers cutting the darkness in flat, vicious lines. Grenade launchers coughing 2 sharp notes into the chaos. The lead enemy elements did not fall. They were simply removed. There and then, not there. The gap between one lightning flash and the next. Then, Blake's hand cupped the air. Silence. Not the silence of waiting. The silence of conclusion. The enemy's momentum was broken. Their confidence was gone. In its place was something the Viet Cong commanders in that valley had almost certainly never felt before in their own jungle. Fear of the dark. Blake had bought exactly what they needed. Time. He pulled a stunned American to his feet, pointed up the ridge. Run. The ridge was a 40-degree slope of mud and root and sheer gravity. The kind of terrain that breaks men who are rested and fully supplied. These men were neither. They ran anyway. Lungs burned. Boots slipped. Men fell on their hands and knees and were hauled upright by whoever was closest. Lawson carried a wounded soldier over one shoulder and pushed another up the slope with his free hand, an act of physical will that should not have been possible. Bullets began to crack through the canopy above them. The enemy, stunned but recovering, were firing blindly into the ridge. Volume over accuracy, sweeping the tree line in frustration. To the left, a machine gun opened up, chewing through a stand of bamboo. To the right, voices converged, trying to cut them off before they crested the ridge. Blake was everywhere, pulling men by their webbing, shouting movement corrections in the lowest possible voice, willing 11 exhausted human beings up a slope that was trying to kill them, through a jungle that was trying to find them, past an enemy that wanted to end them. They crested the first ridgeline. Another slope ahead, steeper. Nobody stopped. And then, over the blood hammering in their ears and the thunder still rolling overhead, they heard it. A sound that cut through every other sound in the world. The rhythmic, unmistakable percussion of rotor blades beating the storm. A Huey, fighting through cloud and downdraft on instruments and nerve alone. The radio crackled. The pilot's voice, tight, controlled, steady, calling for a strobe light. Stone tore a strobe from his webbing and threw it into the clearing at the peak of the ridge. The pulsing white light erupted, a lighthouse in an ocean of black-green, a marker, a target, a promise. The helicopter descended, nose flaring as it fought the downdrafts. Rotor wash hammering the elephant grass flat. It could not land. The terrain was too broken. It hovered 4 feet off the ground, skids deep in the grass, roaring and shuddering, offering exactly one window of salvation. The tree line opened up. Green tracers arced toward the aircraft, punching through the aluminum skin with sounds like metal tearing. The door gunner answered with his M60, barrel glowing, pouring fire into the jungle. The Americans were thrown in first, pushed and hauled into the bay by hands that did not stop moving. Lawson and Quinn took the last wounded soldier between them and heaved him aboard. The aircraft lurched. A round had found something critical near the engine. The pilots screamed that they were leaving. Now, Blake was the last man on the ground. He turned back toward the dark tree line one final time, raised his rifle, emptied his magazine into the jungle in one long, flat, defiant arc. Then he grabbed the skid with both hands and hauled himself inside as the engine hit maximum power and the Huey clawed its way into the storm, rising above the tracers, reaching up from below like fingers denied their prize.
The interior of the helicopter was dark, lit only by the red glow of the instrument panel and the intermittent white of lightning through the plexiglass. Nobody spoke. The Americans sat on the floor, not from cold, but from the massive crash of adrenaline leaving bodies that had been running on nothing else for 12 hours. They looked across the bay at the 5 Australians on the bench seats. The SAS troopers were methodically restacking their magazines, wiping rain from their optics, checking their weapons with the unhurried calm of men completing routine maintenance. Their breathing had already returned to resting rate. Miller stared at Blake across the shuddering, rain-hammered interior of the helicopter. He wanted to say thank
thank you. He wanted to ask how they did it. He wanted to ask if they were even subject to the same physical laws as everyone else, but the words would not come.
What do you say to ghosts?
He said nothing. When the lights of the base emerged in the distance through the rain, a constellation of safety spreading across the dark, the helicopter banked toward them, and Miller understood that he was a different person than the man who had stepped into that jungle 12 hours earlier. He had been to a place that the human mind is not designed to visit and return from unchanged. He had walked through the dark with men who owned it. When the skids hit the tarmac, the spell broke. Medics rushed forward. Stretchers, shouting, the logistics of survival taking over. The Americans were swept toward the field hospital in a controlled chaos of urgency. The Australians stepped off the helicopter and walked. No cheer, no handshake for the cameras, no statement for the record. They collected their gear and faded into the shadows of the compound, disappearing exactly as they had disappeared in the jungle, as if the light itself did not hold them. The official report was 3 paragraphs, classified immediately. It mentioned a reconnaissance patrol extracted under fire. It did not mention the river crossing. It did not mention the duel in the dark. It did not mention the 12 seconds that broke the enemy's pursuit, or the Lawson's hands holding a drowning man underwater to save his life. But Miller remembered. For the rest of his life, whenever rain hit a rooftop at a certain rhythm, or a room went suddenly quiet, in the way rooms do sometimes for no reason, he was back in that basin, lying in the mud, watching 5 men become invisible beside him, watching the darkness become something that worked for him instead of against him. 12 men had gone into that jungle. 12 men had come back. A statistical impossibility. And in the bars and VFW halls in the decades that followed, when the story was told in the low voices that war stories deserve, the men who had been there always said the same thing. The Australians didn't just walk through hell that night. They walked through it like they had been there before, like they knew every turn in the dark, like the jungle had made them an agreement long ago that if they respected it completely, it would let them pass. And that night, it kept its word.